Yeah, thanks again, everybody. I think the timing is actually nice going after Charlie because of some of the motivational stuff I'll talk about. So I'm going to talk about a project where we use machine learning to do emulation of a land model in order to do global parameter calibration. And so this is kind of nice following up on Charlie's talk. Many of you are probably familiar with figures like these, looking across models. Here I'm just showing a figure from the Aurora et al. Paper, looking at the spread in atmosphere land carbon flux between the CMIP5 models and the CMIP6 models. There's a lot of interesting details here. These are, I believe, 1% CO2 simulations, and they're also showing the breakdown when you sort of only let the atmosphere see the CO2 increase in red, or only let the land see the CO2 increase in green, which I'm not really going to talk about that distinction, but to make it easier for ourselves, let's just highlight the zero line here. So thinking about the land as a carbon sink or source, which is similar to what Charlie was talking about. And across both generations of models, you do see that there's significant spread in, just looking at the fully coupled models in blue, there's significant spread in the atmosphere land flux of carbon. Of course, we know that some of this model disagreement comes from uncertainty in the land model structure and parameters. And I like Charlie's point about how we need kind of multiple approaches to thinking about this model disagreement in the terrestrial models. And so what I'll be thinking about and talking about today is the sources of uncertainty in the parameters. So, just to sort of introduce that, I'll be looking at the land component of CESM, CLM, and there's a lot of complexity in this model, and there's a lot of different parameterized processes, as many of us are probably familiar with. But just to sort of show a concrete example of that, one parameter that we're particularly interested in has to do with model conductance, so the trade-off between transpiration and photosynthesis. And so many of you are probably familiar with parameterizations like this, but we're using an empirically derived relationship between model conductance and sort of a normalized photosynthesis on the x-axis here. And so this is from the Medlin et al. Paper, where you can see that when you look across different species, you have different slopes for this relationship. So clearly the slope is different across different species. And so this slope parameter ends up being very important in these terrestrial models, and it represents the marginal water cost of carbon gain. And so one thing we can do is sort of look at the uncertainty in this parameter. Where does the range of values come from, both across plant functional types in the model, but also, taking an individual plant functional type, is there uncertainty in the spread of values within that plant functional type? So that's just an example of the kind of parametric uncertainty that I'm thinking about with this work. I have to kind of skip ahead a little bit in the interest of time, just in terms of the specific parameters that we looked at in this study. I could probably spend a whole talk just thinking about how we did parameter selection and sensitivity. But essentially, I'm looking at 6 different biophysical parameters that kind of touch different components of the model. So I've listed them here. I'm not really going to go through them in great detail, but just if you're interested in the types of processes that we were looking at, model conductance, boundary layer resistance, plant hydraulic stress, and then a variety of other hydrology parameters. So the idea here was that we had this question: can we use machine learning to calibrate model parameters? As many of us know, hand tuning parameter values takes a long time. It takes a lot of human time and computer time. Sometimes it ends up being like a game of whack-a-mole where you fix one thing and it breaks something else. So we were wondering if we could use machine learning to help streamline this process. And I think many of us are also familiar, especially if you've been attending the DOE AI for Earth System Predictability Workshop these past few weeks, familiar with the growing applicability of machine learning for climate science and earth science. So I won't spend too much time on that here, but just to sort of make that point that we're interested in sort of applying these techniques And the reason that we think that this could help is that we could speed up the computational efficiency of doing parameter calibration, especially at the global scale. So what I'm going to talk about is some work where we built an emulator based on a neural network to take model parameter values as input, the 6 parameters that I mentioned a few slides ago, and then predict a set of specific metrics from the land model. And if you're not familiar with neural networks, I just want to use this one slide to sort of introduce the concept. So we're thinking about supervised machine learning in this application, meaning that we have a set of input data, which is the parameters, and we have a set of output data, which is our training data from some simulations that I'll talk about. And essentially, we're just learning a functional relationship between the input and output data. And it's at its core just regression. So given a set of input X and output Y, use an optimizer to search for a function that fits the data well, but also is able to generalize to unseen data so that we can then sort of apply the emulator to test out different parameter combinations. And the neural network just allows us to feature many nonlinear and linear interactions between the input and output data. So as a brief roadmap for the rest of the talk, I'll talk about the training process for the neural networks. I'll talk about using them as emulators to increase the computational efficiency, and then talk about the calibration piece where we bring in the observations and try to minimize the error in the predictions relative to observations. And then finally, a little bit on testing the optimal parameter values back in the full land surface model. So again, the training process is taking land model parameter values as input and using an ensemble of model simulations to train the emulator. And so just a brief note on generating the training data. We ran a land model, so land only, uncoupled land simulations, perturbed parameter ensemble using 100 different parameter combinations generated with Latin hypercube sampling. And then a note about the metrics that we were training the emulator to predict, because this is an important sort of piece in the process. We decided to use principal component analysis to predict the modes of variability of carbon and water fluxes. And so this is just showing one of those metrics in particular. This is the distribution of across the ensemble members, the first principal component of GPP. And the reason that we did this was primarily to reduce the dimensionality of the problem, while also hopefully preserving some of the spatial information instead of just emulating the global mean quantities. Okay, I lost my cursor. Hang on a second. Can everyone still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, sorry about that. Fun Zoom times. Okay, so you might be interested in what these PCs look like spatially. So I also just wanted to include for GPP the accompanying empirical orthogonal functions for the first 3 modes. And the reason we're only using the first 3 modes is that after that it gets very noisy and it's not very an important component to the percent of the variance. But you can see, perhaps unsurprisingly, that the first mode of GPP is largely a tropical signal, with other regions sort of popping out in the higher modes. Okay, so returning to this picture for the training process, just adding a little bit more detail. So the input to the neural network was the 6 parameters and the 100 ensemble members that we have for our PPE. And then we're training it to predict the first 3 modes of variability. I'll just note that we built a separate emulator for the first 3 PCs of latent heat flux. So I'll be talking about sort of both of those quantities. And then of course we want to assess the skill of the emulator to make sure that it's making accurate predictions. So one way of doing that is just to look at the neural network predictions as compared to the original model output. And so we want to see a nice correlation of those across all the different metrics that we're looking at. But I also ran a second ensemble to kind of test the performance on a large out of sample validation test. So this is the predictive skill where I'm using the same trained emulator, but I have a whole new set of 100 different parameter values and model output. So what this is showing us is that the emulator's ability to generalize to sort of the unseen data. So I've already sort of talked about the emulation step with that testing of the skill, but again, to emphasize that the trained neural network can take new parameter values and give you predictions a lot more computationally efficiently than running the full land surface model. And just for fun, as a sort of very direct comparison of these two things, the particular version of the land model that I was running globally took about 2 hours per simulation. I was only running 20-year simulations. They were pretty short, pretty low resolution, but even so, a couple of hours per simulation compared to a couple of seconds to generate predictions with the emulators. So you can really see how, in terms of calibration, we'd be able to generate a lot of these much more quickly. Another kind of fun result from this was being able to do some interpretation on the trained emulator. So here I'm just going to show one interpretability method that I used, which is called variable or feature importance. So basically what this does is it looks at the trained emulators and it asks the question, are there particular inputs, meaning parameters, that are really important to the skill of the prediction of these quantities? And so when we sort of do that calculation, when we look across the parameters and we remove the skill from each of them, and then we look at the results, the larger bars in terms of the mean squared error means that that parameter is more important to the skill of the emulator. So it's kind of interesting to compare, for example, the first PC of GPP being very dominated by one parameter in particular, which is a plant hydraulic stress parameter, versus looking at latent heat flux, where we have more even distribution of importance in the parameters, with the Medlin slope parameter coming again as important. And these plots also look different when you look at the higher modes. So that's just kind of an interesting application of using these emulators, but we also want to get to the calibration step as well. So this is where we bring in observations. We're using FluxNet observations of GPP and latent heat flux. And we want to sort of ask the emulator, can you give us the best set of parameter values that match the observations? And so I'm showing several different things here in these bar charts across all 6 metrics for calibration. So that's another important point, that we have a sort of multi-objective calibration problem here, where we have 3 principal components for both GPP and latent heat flux. So the observations are in red. The model default for these metrics is in black. The optimized predictions from the emulator is in blue. So you can kind of compare how well the calibration does if you compare the blue bar to the red bar. And then the green bar is when we actually go and test those optimal parameters back in CLM. So you can compare a couple of different things here. You can compare how well the green bar is represented by the blue bar. So what that is telling you is how well the emulator is doing in terms of what it thinks the model would give us. So there's some interesting differences there, but in general, the first modes are pretty good agreement. You can also compare how well the model is getting pushed towards the observations in red, especially in the context of the black, which is the default model. So there's a lot to unpack here, but I think what is also interesting to look at in terms of this testing is just what these metrics look like spatially. So that's what I'm showing here. So instead of looking at it in the principal component space, just saying, okay, what does GPP, what does latent heat flux look like in the optimized model relative to the default model? So the left-hand column is the optimized CLM, where we've fed back in the best fit parameter values. And then on the right is the default model, both relative to these observational data sets. And so the one sentence summary is that it looks like it's getting better in some places, but it might be getting worse in others. So even though we saw improvement in kind of the principal component space, that's not necessarily reflective of the global spatially resolved picture. And there are some potential reasons for this. We haven't accounted for additional sources of uncertainty, like foreseeing observations, structural uncertainty. We're also sort of very limited in our observations, and so limited in our choice of output variables. We've only focused on GPP and latent heat flux here. We also didn't really take into account the seasonal cycle. So I kind of brushed over this before, but when we do the PCA, we're doing that on annual mean output from the model. So we're not taking into account variation across the seasonal cycle. So that could be another useful dimension of the calibration to actually look at that, how that varies with time. Okay, so trying to finish up quickly here, but I want to just mention that we can take it a step further beyond just a single set of optimal parameters and also look at distributions of optimal parameters in a sort of, space where we're comparing how all the, not just the optimal distributions, but the parameter relationships. So there's a little bit of that in the paper as well. But we can also do a more formal Bayesian inference and use something like Markov chain Monte Carlo to generate parameter posterior distributions. So that's what I'm showing here. These are all normalized parameter values on the x-axis. So 0 is the minimum value, 1 is the max. But still, it gives you a sense of sort of where the optimization is pushing the parameter space. And then just something that I'm thinking about is how to put these results in the context of the climate predictions, like what I showed at the beginning. So one thing that I've done is I've trained a different neural network to emulate the future climate response of the land surface model, just in a very idealistic sense, like just plus 2K warming everywhere in land-only simulations. But what we can do is run those parameter posterior distributions through that emulator. And then what we can look at is comparing the distribution of responses, say in the global mean change in GPP on the top, or the global mean change in latent heat flux, and compare the full parameter space with the posterior distributions that are, at least according to the emulation, the sort of optimal parameters to fit observations. So potentially a way to start constraining the uncertainty that's coming from these parameters in this model. So I'll just leave my summary up here and also mention that we're currently extending this work to a large CLM perturbed parameter ensemble experiment. So it'll be interesting to try out different emulation methods, different calibration methods, and also expand the scope across the parameter space of CLM. So thanks very much for your attention.